You know, normally when we talk about getting a medical diagnosis, there's this very specific expectation of precision.
Right, yeah. It's almost like mechanical engineering.
Exactly. I mean,
Yep.
you fall off your bike, you break your arm, and the doctor puts you in an X-ray machine, and boom, there's that jagged white line right on the film.
Yeah, the doctor just points a pen at it and says, well, there is the fracture. It's totally binary.
Right. Broken or not broken. You don't have to, like, debate the philosophy of the bone. It's just a clean, visually verifiable reality.
And we really crave that, you know? We find immense comfort in things that can be categorized so neatly.
We really do. But the moment you zoom out from the individual human body and you step into the world of civilizational health.
Oh, right. Specifically civilizational collapse.
Yes, civilizational collapse. That X-ray machine suddenly seems totally useless. We find ourselves looking at a diagnostic landscape that feels, completely murky.
Yeah, we just assume it's unpredictable.
And the reason we assume it's unpredictable brings me to this massive historical paradox. This is really the launching pad for our deep dive today.
It's a fascinating paradox, really.
It is, because every single civilization that has ever collapsed firmly genuinely believed it was the one glorious exception to the rule.
Right. It is the absolute definition of muddy diagnostic waters, primarily because the patient in this scenario aggressively refuses to look at their own symptoms.
They don't just refuse to look, they write like entire libraries about how incredibly healthy they are while actively bleeding out.
Exactly. It's systemic denial.
I want to spend a moment on these historical delusions of grandeur for you all listening because they are just fascinating. Take the Romans, for instance.
Oh, the quintessential example of institutional arrogance.
Completely. I mean, the Romans looked around at their societal architecture and thought they had quite literally conquered the concept of time.
Yeah, they had aqueducts moving millions of gallons of water across hundreds of miles.
Right. They had poured concrete that we still can't perfectly replicate today.
And they had a legal code that dictated everything from, property rights to contract law with excruciating precision.
And when you sit in the Senate in Rome, surrounded by marble, looking at trade routes that stretch from Britannia all the way to Syria.
You don't think, oh, we are a temporary arrangement.
No. You think, we have cracked the final code of human society.
You assume permanence because your immediate physical surroundings project permanence.
Exactly. And then, you fast forward a millennium or two and you have the British Empire.
Right. Who looked at the Romans like absolute amateurs.
They really did. The British genuinely believed they had solved the puzzle of organized governance at a global scale.
I mean, they had the East India Company, which was essentially corporate administration armed with a massive navy.
Yeah, they mapped the globe, implemented the telegraph, standardized global time with Greenwich.
And they told themselves the sun never sets on us because we have fundamentally optimized administration.
Right. And they justified it through this lens of civilizational duty.
They really thought their bureaucratic systems were immune to the rot that took down ancient empires just because their ledgers were better kept.
Which is wild. And then you step into the 20th century with the Soviet project.
Oh, yeah. They looked back at Rome and London and just laughed.
They did. They deeply fundamentally believed that they had discovered the final mathematically and scientifically perfect form of social organization.
They didn't even rely on tradition. They relied on what they called scientific socialism.
Right. They had these 5-year plans that dictated the exact production quotas of every nail, every tractor.
They thought they had entirely bypassed the messy, emotional errors of human history through sheer cold planning.
Which is the ultimate irony, right? Given how quickly that particular experiment fractured.
Oh, absolutely.
But that's the kicker. Every single one of these civilizations had periods of genuine, undeniable prosperity.
Yeah, they had real functional achievements. They weren't stupid.
Not at all. They could point to their aqueducts, their telegraphs, their Sputniks, and say to you, look, we are doing it right. The data proves it.
And yet, despite operating under completely different ideologies
and wildly varying technological baselines.
Right, and despite occupying different geographies, they all slammed face first into the exact same structural wall.
Which is precisely why our source material for today's deep dive is so incredibly vital.
It really is. What we're exploring today is essentially an ancient, highly sophisticated diagnostic manual for that exact structural wall.
So let's lay our cards on the table for everyone listening. Today, we are pulling from a deeply analytical interpretation of a foundational text.
Specifically, verses 35 through 40 of Al-Furqan.
Yes. But we were exploring this text through a very specific, fiercely rational lens. We're looking at the analysis of a 20th century philosopher named Ghulam Ahmed Parvez.
And we should set a firm rule for this conversation right out of the gate.
Please do.
We are not having a theological discussion today. Not even slightly.
Right, zero theology.
And honestly, that is the most striking element of Parvez's framework. He approaches these specific verses not as a collection of mythological fables.
No angry deities throwing lightning bolts from the clouds.
Exactly. He reads them as a cold, hard, empirical data presentation.
It literally reads like a systems engineer doing a post-mortem on why a skyscraper fell down.
That is the perfect way to phrase it. Parvez strips away centuries of religious sentimentality and superstition.
There is zero moralizing here in the way we usually understand it.
Right, no weeping about sinners in some vague spiritual sense. It is purely an exploration of societal physics.
Cause and effect, input and output.
Exactly.
So to give you all a roadmap of what we're doing today, our mission is to look at these 6 verses as a sociological manual.
A manual that diagnoses exactly how what we will call extractive architectures inevitably collapse.
Yes, extractive architectures.
Yeah.
We are going to explore why the evidence of impending doom is always hidden in plain sight.
And why incredibly intelligent societies actively choose to ignore the structural rust eating away at their own foundations.
Right. And to really grasp the surgical precision of this manual, we have to start by completely deconstructing the language we use to translate it.
Yeah, Parvez begins his analysis with a linguistic deep dive into the classical Arabic terms utilized in these verses.
And it just completely shatters the traditional paradigm. Let's get into the text itself. Verse 39 states, وَكُلَّ خَرَبْنَا لَهُ الْأَمْثَالَ.
Right.
Now, if you pick up a standard off-the-shelf translation, it will say something to the effect of, and for each of them, we struck examples.
Which is an incredibly weak translation, honestly.
Right, because when I hear we struck examples, I immediately think of Aesop's fables.
Yeah, exactly.
Think of a grandfather telling a kid, don't be greedy like the boy who cried wolf, or bad things will happen. It sounds quaint.
It sounds like a moral suggestion, and that mistranslation really neuters the sociological power of the text.
So what's the actual weight of the word there?
Well, the core word there is mathal. In classical Arabic, particularly within this highly analytical context, a mathal is not a cute little story.
Right.
It denotes a recurring structural pattern. It is a deep, functional analogy that reveals the systemic blueprint operating beneath the surface.
Okay, stop there for a second. I want to make sure I am fully grasping the mechanics of this. Give me a modern equivalent of a masal in the way Parvez is using it.
Okay, think about the structural similarities between the internet and a biological neural network in a human brain.
Oh, interesting.
Or even the mycelial networks of fungi in a forest.
Yeah.
On the surface, a fiber optic cable under the ocean looks absolutely nothing like a mushroom in the dirt.
No, totally different visually.
But if you analyze the system of how nodes communicate, how information is routed around damage, how resources are distributed, the underlying architecture is identical.
Ah, I see.
That shared architectural reality is a mathal.
Okay, so when the text says, we struck the amthal for them, it isn't saying, we told them a bedtime story about a ruined city.
Exactly. It's saying, we presented them with the architectural blueprint of civilizational failure.
Wow. So the historical data of previous collapses was available to them.
Yes. The Romans knew about the collapse of the Greeks. The British knew about the collapse of Rome.
So the text is pointing out that the structural formula, the exact equation of why a society eats itself, was right there in the historical record.
They were not flying blind. The pattern was legible to anyone willing to look at it.
Which flows perfectly into understanding the title of the text itself, Al-Furqan.
Right, because Parvez points out that this Furqan was available to all of these collapsed communities.
And we need to be incredibly precise about what that means for you listening. It absolutely does not mean that the people of Ad or the Romans or the Soviets all had the exact same written book magically handed down to them.
No, not at all. Parvez defines Furqan as a cognitive tool. It refers to human discriminative capacity.
Discriminative in what sense, exactly?
In the sense of being able to separate signal from noise, reality from illusion. It is the inherent intellectual and rational ability within human beings to distinguish between haq and batil.
Let's define those two terms because, again, they carry a ton of heavy moral baggage in traditional circles. We really need to look at them structurally.
Yeah, in Parwaz's systems engineering framework, hack is not just some abstract philosophical truth.
Right, it's not about being morally good in a vacuum.
Exactly. Hack refers to a productive, sustainable, reality-based system. It is a social architecture that actually aligns with the fundamental laws of societal physics.
So it's a system where effort matches reward.
Yes, where resources circulate freely and where human potential is nurtured rather than crushed.
And Batil, how does he define Batil?
Batil is the exact opposite. It is an extractive, false, displaced system. It's a social architecture built entirely on hoarding, coercion, and exploitation.
Like a parasite on the society.
Precisely. And the insidious thing about a Batil system is that it often looks like it's working.
Right, it can build massive monuments.
Yeah, it can generate immense wealth for a tiny fraction of people. But structurally, it is a snake eating its own tail.
Yeah.
It fundamentally cannot sustain itself.
So, connecting the dots here for a second. Every human civilization possesses the Furqan.
Yes, every single one.
Every ordinary citizen
Yeah.
has the built-in rational capacity to look at their own society and say, hey, a system where a handful of people hoard all the grain while the farmers starve is fundamentally Batil.
Right, they can see that it's extracted.
They know the math does not add up, and eventually this is going to fail. They have the diagnostic tool right there in their own minds.
They possess the tool, the Furqan, and they possess the historical data, the mythal, showing exactly what happens when you ignore that tool.
And yet they still drive right off the cliff.
They do, every time.
Which brings us to the second half of verse 39. And honestly, this is where the systems engineering perspective really locks in for me.
Oh, the concept of tatbir.
Yes. The text says, Wakula tabarna tatbira. And each of them we shattered into total shattering.
Tatbir, it's such a heavy word.
It is. And that word implies a very specific type of destruction. Because, when we read Edward Gibbon, or when we casually talk about the decline and fall of empires, we tend to imagine a slow fade.
Right, we picture a battery just slowly losing its charge over a couple of centuries.
Exactly. But Tatbir is not a slow, gentle sunset. It's entirely different.
It really is.
I want to use an analogy here to make this intensely visual for the audience. Imagine a massive, state-of-the-art suspension bridge spanning a really deep river gorge.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Millions of commuters drive over it every single year. For 50 years, it looks completely invincible. The cables are thick, the towers are huge.
It looks permanent, like the Romans looking at their aqueducts.
It looks completely permanent.
Yeah.
But inside the steel, deep at the molecular level, microfractures are silently accumulating.
Right, metal fatigue.
Exactly, what engineers call metal fatigue. Now, to the naked eye of a commuter driving a sedan over it, the bridge is perfectly fine. The paint is fresh.
The traffic is flowing, the toll booths are generating millions in revenue.
But fundamentally, silently, the structural integrity of the metal is being displaced by repeated stress.
That is the Batil system at work inside the steel. It's hidden but active.
Exactly. And eventually, one single delivery truck drives over that bridge. It's not even an unusually heavy truck, it's just an average Tuesday.
Right, just a normal day.
But the stress of that specific truck hits the exact mathematical threshold where those millions of microfractures finally connect.
The breaking point.
In a matter of 12 seconds, the entire integrated million-ton structure violently fragments and collapses into the river below.
Wow.
Suddenly, totally, catastrophically. That is Tatbir.
That analogy perfectly captures Parwaz's reading because the text connects this sudden, total fragmentation, this tatbir, to another really crucial concept.
The Sa.
Yes, the saw. Let's pull that apart.
Let's do it. Because in traditional translations, Sa is usually rendered as the hour, right?
Right, often evoking this apocalyptic, end-of-the-world mystical imagery.
But sociologically, structurally, what is it?
Structurally, the saya represents the tipping point. It is the exact second that delivery truck hits the microfractures. It is the moment where accumulated, hidden systemic dysfunction becomes completely, mathematically irreversible.
The absolute point of no return.
Yes. And the historical record proves that this pattern repeats with terrifying consistency, regardless of a community's language, their geography, or what gods they pray to.
Right. The structural physics of the bridge do not care if the commuters driving over it speak Latin or English or Russian.
Exactly. The steel doesn't care if you have an emperor or a parliament.
If the internal architecture is extractive and the microfractures accumulate past the threshold,
Tatbir occurs. The Sai arrives, the system shatters.
Okay, this is brilliant, but it immediately raises a glaring, massive question, a really paradoxical question for me.
What's that?
If human beings are equipped with this built-in rational tool, the Furqan, and if the historical data of past collapses, the mythal, is clearly visible in the ruins around them, I mean, why do incredibly smart civilizations consistently ignore the rust on their own bridge?
That is the big question.
Right. Why do millions of human beings just quietly go along with an extractive system that is actively creating the microfractures that will eventually drown them? Our whole population is just inherently foolish.
Far from it. And this is exactly where Parwez's analysis transitions from structural diagnosis into a really ruthless political and economic critique.
I love this part.
The sources delve into what we can label the three pillars of extractive architecture.
Okay, the three pillars.
Yes. The reason societies ignore the Furqan is not because they are stupid. It is because there are deeply entrenched, powerful, vested interests that actively, aggressively suppress the society's capacity to use reason.
They realize that if people look too closely at the bridge, it threatens their toll revenue.
Exactly. So they make it dangerous or socially unacceptable to point out the rust.
So what are these three pillars?
The text identifies a tripartite alliance, a three-headed monster of vested interests that historically emerges in every society to crush human reason and enforce compliance with an extractive system.
And the text uses three specific historical archetypes to represent these forces.
Very nice.
Let's dedicate some serious time to exploring these, because to me, this is the master key to understanding our own modern world, not just ancient history.
I could completely agree.
Okay, pillar number one is Mulukiyat, represented historically by the figure of Pharaoh.
Mulukiyat represents the monopoly on violence. It is political tyranny and the absolute subjugation of the physical body.
So it's the state apparatus.
Yes, it's the state apparatus that looks at the citizenry and says, if you speak up against the architecture of the society, we will crush you physically.
It's the rawest form of coercion.
Exactly. Historically, it was the emperor's guard or the king's executioner.
Yeah.
In the Soviet context, it was the gulag and the secret police. It is the entity that controls the armies, the prisons, and the legal framework of punishment. The pharaoh archetype doesn't need you to believe in the system.
He just needs you to be too terrified of physical agony to challenge it.
Precisely.
Okay, so that handles the physical threat. But you can't build a complex global civilization purely on the threat of the sword. I mean, people eventually rebel against pure pain.
They do. History shows us that constantly.
Which brings us to pillar number two, Sarmayadari, represented by the figure of Korun, or Korah in English. Let's unpack the mechanics of Sarmayadari.
Sarmayadari is capitalist and economic exploitation. It represents the hoarding of wealth and the structural starvation of the masses.
So if Pharaoh controls your physical body,
Harun controls your stomach, your shelter, and your future.
the economic elite.
Yes, but it's more than just being rich. It is an architecture of displacement. The Sarmayadari class actively displaces resources from the many to the few.
Give me an historical example of that.
Well, in ancient Rome, this was the latifundia system. Wealthy patricians buying up all the farmland, using slave labor, and completely displacing the independent Roman farmers.
Forcing them into the cities to live on state handouts.
Exactly. It's a structural bottleneck of resources.
So how does that suppress the Furqan? How does economic hoarding actually stop people from using their reason?
Because it shifts the human focus entirely to basic survival. When the Sarmayadari control the jobs, the supply chains, the credit systems, and the land, they make the cost of descent impossibly high.
Ah, I see.
If you challenge the structural integrity of the societal bridge, Pharaoh might not throw you in a dungeon, but Korun will ensure you are fired, your credit is ruined, and your family starves.
You are subjugated by debt and dependency.
Exactly. The cognitive bandwidth required to use your Furqan to critique society is completely eaten up by the panic of trying to pay your rent.
That is painfully relevant to today.
Very much so.
But even with physical fear and economic dependency, human beings have a spirit.
Yeah.
They have a tendency to ask why.
They do.
And this is where the third pillar comes in. And I think it is the most insidious, the most complex, and honestly the most dangerous of the three. Pillar number 3 is Peshawayat, represented by the figure of Homa.
Peshawayat represents the ideological manipulation class. Historically, this was the religious priesthood. They are the architects of the narrative.
So they don't chain the body or the wallet.
No, they chain the mind.
How does the Haman figure operate within this alliance?
The Haman figure's job is to launder the extraction. Their role is to look at the massive inequality created by Harun and the brutal violence enforced by Pharaoh, and convince the masses that this arrangement is actually noble.
Or divine or scientifically inevitable.
Exactly. In ancient times, the priests would tell the starving peasant, yes, the king has all the grain, but he is the son of the sun god. And if you rebel, the rains will stop.
They displaced the peasants' anger into religious fear.
Yes.
But Parwez is looking at this as a sociological pattern, right? Which means the Haman archetypes isn't just a guy in religious robes. What does Peshawayat look like in a secular society?
Oh, it looks like the modern PR industry. It looks like political spin rooms, hyper-partisan media networks, and algorithmic echo chambers.
Wow.
It looks like the hustle culture influencers telling a gig worker who's working 80 hours a week just to survive that if they just optimize their morning routine, they too can become billionaires.
That is wild. So the modern priesthood tells you that the structural flaw is actually just your own personal failing.
Precisely. Peshawayat convinces you that the microfractures in the bridge are just a figment of your imagination.
Or worse, that the microfractures are actually making the bridge stronger.
Exactly. They suppress the Furqan by flooding the zone with so much narrative noise, so much manufactured culture war, that the Ajib citizens simply cannot distinguish Hak from Batil anymore.
So if we step back and look at this tripartite alliance, it is terrifyingly synergistic. Let's walk through the gauntlet an ordinary citizen faces if they try to use their Furqan.
It's a brutal gauntlet.
It really is. The Haman figure, the ideologue, the media spin doctor, the algorithmic feat, first tries to convince you that the extractive system is completely natural and good, so you shouldn't even want to change it.
Right.
If you see through that lie, you run into the Harun figure, the monopolist, the corporate landlord, the creditor who controls your livelihood. They make it so that even if you want to change it, you literally cannot afford to change it without ruining your family's survival.
The economic trap.
And if you are brave enough to risk starvation and you still try to organize against the system, you meet the Pharaoh figure, the militarized police, the state apparatus, who will simply lock you in a cage or kill you for trying to change it.
That is the anatomy of an extractive architecture, flawlessly summarized. When these three forces synchronize, they artificially inflate the social, economic, and physical cost of applying reason.
I really want to hammer this point home for everyone listening because it reframes all of history.
It really does.
The pattern of civilizational collapse is almost never about a sudden drop in IQ. It is not about a lack of basic intelligence among the general populace.
No, the average Roman baker or the average Soviet factory worker wasn't foolish.
Right. They saw the rot. But the tripartite alliance made the cost of saying this system is fundamentally batil, equal to death, starvation, or social excommunication.
So what do people do? They put their heads down?
They try to protect their immediate family, they compartmentalize the dread, and the systemic dysfunction just keeps silently, invisibly accumulating inside the steel.
Right. And this brings us back to the physics of the bridge. The elites, Pharaoh, Harun, and Haman, can enforce complete compliance.
They can arrest every whistleblower.
They can buy up all the media to say the bridge is fine, but they cannot negotiate with the structural reality of metal fatigue.
You can threaten a bridge inspector into signing off on a fraudulent safety report, but your threats do not stop the steel from snapping.
Exactly. The laws of societal physics are absolutely immune to political spin.
Okay, this is profound, but I have to push back here.
Go for it.
I have to voice this skepticism that I know is bubbling up in the minds of our listeners right now. Because someone listening to this deep dive is sitting in a Tesla or looking at their smartphone or working in a massive tech hub, and they are thinking,
We are different.
yes, they're thinking, this is a great historical theory. I totally get how that happened to the Romans with their swords or the agricultural empires of the past. But we are fundamentally different.
The great modern myth.
They think, we have mapped the human genome. We have artificial intelligence that can write code. We have global just-in-time supply chains. We can literally edit DNA. We aren't going to collapse like the people of Ad or the Soviets because our technology creates a safety net that previous empires couldn't even dream of.
Yes. Though we have better tech fallacy.
The tech fallacy.
It is the most seductive, the most pervasive, and honestly the most dangerous defense mechanism that every modern, complex society utilizes to shield itself from the Furqan.
So how does Parwez's reading dismantle that fallacy? Because, let's be honest, it does feel palpably different when you have a supercomputer in your pocket that can access the sum of human knowledge.
Of course it feels different, but it dismantles it by drawing a razor-sharp distinction between technology and architecture.
Okay, unpack that.
The fatal flaw in modern thinking is conflating the two. The pattern of civilizational collapse, the accumulation of microfractures, operates strictly at the architectural level of a society, not the technological level.
Elaborate on that distinction. Break that down for me.
A technology is utterly agnostic. It is
Right.
merely an amplifier. It is a tool that scales whatever underlying architecture you plug it into.
Right.
A highly sophisticated technological society can still possess a fundamentally extractive, displaced, bitil architecture.
So the tech doesn't fix the architecture.
No. If your underlying socioeconomic system is heavily tilted towards sarmayadari, meaning structural hoarding of wealth and the exploitation of labor, then inventing AI or globalized supply chains won't save you from the map of collapse.
In fact, it does the opposite.
Precisely, it accelerates it. If you plug a supercomputer into an extractive architecture, it just allows the Harun class to extract wealth at the speed of light via algorithmic high-frequency trading.
Yeah.
If you give advanced surveillance technology to a Malukiat system, it just allows Pharaoh to monitor dissent with terrifying efficiency. Technology does not cure the metal fatigue. It just puts heavier, faster trucks on the bridge.
It accelerates the accumulation of dysfunction.
Exactly.
So possessing an iPhone or having a reusable rocket doesn't change the fact that the socioeconomic bridge is rusting from the inside out.
Not one bit.
It just means you can live stream the bridge, collapsing in 4K resolution, while you are plummeting into the river.
That is a dark but entirely accurate application of the concept.
It really is.
And this disconnect, the illusion that technological comfort equals structural health, is addressed brilliantly in our source material through a highly relatable medical analogy.
Oh, right. Let's get into this.
To explain how the saw, the tipping point, actually arrives, Parwaz likens the collapse of an extractive society to the biological process of a kidney stone.
Okay, I absolutely love this analogy. Let's really walk through the medical mechanics of this because it perfectly visualizes the hidden accumulation we've been talking about.
Think of a patient, a completely normal person. One night at 3 a.m., they wake up absolutely screaming in agony.
The worst pain imaginable.
The pain in their flank is sudden, acute, and completely debilitating. It feels like they're being stabbed. To the patient and to their panicked family, the disaster happened all of a sudden overnight.
Right. They went to bed feeling perfectly fine, and they woke up in a state of biological emergency.
Exactly. But what happens when the ambulance gets them to the hospital?
The doctor administers a CT scan or an X-ray.
And the scan reveals the truth. The patient is suffering from a massive kidney stone. Now, biologically speaking, a kidney stone of that size does not form overnight.
No, it takes years.
The medical reality is that the stone has been silently accumulating, crystallizing layer by microscopic layer for years.
Based on the patient's diet, their hydration, their biological
Yeah,
input.
exactly. Every time they drank too much soda and not enough water, they added a microscopic layer of calcium or uric acid to the stone.
So the pain was sudden. The crisis felt immediate. But the systemic failure, the accumulation of the blockage, was a very long, very quiet process.
So if we take this medical reality and map it onto the historical data set presented in Al-Furqan,
The communities mentioned in the text, the ones that hit Tatpir, the total shattering, were societies that had been silently accumulating socioeconomic kidney stones for centuries.
yes, their massive wealth inequality was crystallizing year by year.
Their political corruption and institutional decay was calcifying.
The ideological manipulation by their elites was hardening the social arteries.
But here's the obvious question for me. If the kidney stone is growing for decades, why didn't the civilization feel the pain earlier?
It's a great question.
Right. Why didn't the patient catch it when it was just a tiny crystal? If human beings have the Furqan, shouldn't they have felt the twinge of pain and changed their diet?
That is where the genius of the tripartite alliance comes in. In an extractive architecture, the elites, the pharaohs, the Quaruns, and the Hamans are structurally insulated from the early symptoms of societal decay.
Insulated how?
They possess the resources to essentially buy powerful painkillers that numb the nervous system of the society.
Oh, that's fascinating. What do sociological painkillers look like?
They look like gated communities. They look like private power grids, private security forces, offshore bank accounts, and concierge healthcare.
So they completely remove themselves from the consequences of their own architecture.
Precisely. When an extractive economy falters, it is the poorest, the most vulnerable citizens who feel the pain first. They're the nerve endings at the extremities of the body.
But because the elites control the media, Hammond, and the state,
They just ignore the pain of the extremities. The elites barely notice a dip in their luxury. They look at the stock market, see it going up, and assume the body is healthy.
they ignore the warning signs because the pain hasn't reached the central nervous system of the ruling class yet.
Exactly. But the socioeconomic stone is still growing, and when it finally dislodges, when it finally blocks the main ureter of the society, when the saw arrives,
The painkillers stop working.
and the entire integrated body collapses in agony.
So the suddenness of a civilization's fall is a complete illusion. The surprise of the collapse is just the exact moment the accumulated pain finally hits the insulated center of the system.
Yes, it's not a surprise to the architecture.
Honestly, that is a chilling, terrifying way to look at history. It completely reframes how we view stability.
It really does.
Which brings us to the physical evidence. Because if this cycle is real, if the kidney stone really does burst, it leaves a mess.
A massive mess.
And that is exactly what Section 4 of our deep dive focuses on. Verse 40 and the concept of the law of requital.
Yes. Mukafat e amal. The law of requital. This is the absolute center of Parwes's highly rationalist empirical reading of the text.
Let's look closely at the language of verse 40. It says, Walakanata alagorati alati urat mayara asa.
Which translates roughly to, and they have certainly passed by the town that was rained upon with a rain of evil.
Now stop right there. Because if you read rained upon with a rain of evil with a traditional mythological mindset, it conjures up very specific Hollywood imagery.
Oh, absolutely.
You picture Zeus throwing thunderbolts or, fiery meteors of brimstone raining down from the sky to smite the wicked villagers.
Yeah.
It sounds like supernatural magic.
It does sound like that. But Parwes clarifies with intense linguistic discipline that this phrase is not mythological. It is deeply, intensely geographical. It is physical.
What do you mean by geographical? Let's unpack that.
It means that the law of requital mukafat amal operates in real historical time entirely within the physical world. It is the law of cause and effect applied to sociology. It dictates that specific socioeconomic inputs yield specific, inescapable material outputs.
So when an extractive architecture hits the saw and collapses, it doesn't just vanish into a mystical ether.
No, it leaves incredibly heavy physical traces. It leaves actual tangible ruins in the landscape.
So the rain of evil isn't fire from the sky.
The reign of evil is a metaphor for the devastating material consequences of systemic failure, severe famine, the crumbling of aqueducts and bridges, catastrophic civil war, the burning of libraries, and the physical hollowing out of massive cities.
So when the text says, they have certainly passed by the town, it is not speaking poetically, it's being literal.
Utterly literal. It is pointing directly to the archaeological record beneath their feet.
Wow.
The text is essentially saying you don't need a mystic or a priest or a prophet to tell you how this specific economic model ends. Just look out the window of your caravan as you travel.
That brings us to what I genuinely think is my favorite phrase in this entire analysis. The verse immediately continues by asking a rhetorical question. Afalam yakunu yara.
Did they not see them?
Did they not see them? And the most devastating, important word in that entire sentence is saw.
Visual, empirical, undeniable observation.
Exactly. I want to paint a picture for the listener here. Because the psychological resonance of this is wild when you apply it to our modern world.
Go ahead.
Imagine a group of modern corporate executives flying in a private jet, looking down at the rusted-out, hollowed factories of a dead industry in the American Rust Belt.
Right?
Or imagine global political leaders taking a luxury, guided tour through the ruins of the Colosseum in Rome, taking selfies in front of the crumbling stone, or walking through the ziggurats of Mesopotamia.
They are looking right at it.
They are literally physically seeing the empirical evidence of the law of requital. The archaeological record of every major civilizational collapse isn't hidden. It is completely obsessively documented.
Yeah, we have massive museums full of this stuff.
We have entire well-funded university departments dedicated entirely to studying exactly how the soil depletion in Mesopotamia or the inflation in Rome caused their systems to fail.
We have the mythal. We have the pattern physically laid out in stone and rusted steel before us.
Right. We have the data. So the ultimate question the text asks is not whether the evidence of civilizational collapse exists. The evidence is undeniable. The ruins are real, and they are everywhere.
So what is the question?
The profound question the text asks is whether the current community, our community, or any contemporary society will actually apply their discriminative capacity, their Furqan, to the ruins they are looking at.
Or will they succumb to the intoxicating arrogance of thinking they are immune?
Exactly. Will that executive look down at the rusted factory and say, wow, the law of requital is real? An extractive economic model that prioritized short-term shareholder returns over long-term labor stability destroyed this town. We need to radically change our corporate architecture.
Which is the rational application of the Furqan.
Right. Or will they look at the ruins, shrug, and say, well, they just didn't have the sophisticated algorithmic financial instruments and AI supply chain management that we have today?
And historically, tragically, the vested interests almost always choose the latter.
They always do.
They walk through the ruins of Rome and think, what a shame they didn't understand modern monetary theory, entirely missing the point that the structural displacement of wealth, the sarmayadari, the hoarding by the patrician class, was the actual cause of the microfractures.
They mistake a difference in technology for a difference in architecture.
Exactly.
Which perfectly transitions us into the final synthesis of Parwiz's analysis, Section 5 of our outline, the tension between human agency and historical determinism.
This is a really crucial philosophical distinction.
Because I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, if this pattern of collapse is an ironclad law, if it is mathematically inevitable that extractive systems collapse, it almost sounds like we are just helpless victims of history. It sounds completely fatalistic.
It does sound like that, but the source material makes a very specific distinction here. Parwiz's reading is essentially a massive statistical argument, but it is not a fatalistic one.
A statistical argument for history. I love the framing of that. Explain how that works.
Well, think about the historical pattern presented in Al-Furqan, the list of collapsed societies. It is arguably the most empirically grounded, statistically significant argument you can make about human sociology.
Because the sample size is so large.
Exactly. The sample size of collapsed extractive civilizations is enormous. It comprises virtually every major civilization that has preceded us.
Right.
Therefore, mathematically, statistically, the burden of proof is entirely on the civilization claiming to be the exception. The burden of proof is not on the historian or the sociologist pointing out the pattern.
Right. It's like basic physics. If
Yep.
I hold out my hand and drop 100 apples, and all 100 apples fall to the
The
ground,
law of gravity.
and then I pick up the 101st apple, and I tell you, hey, this specific apple is going to float in midair because I painted it blue and put a Bluetooth chip inside it.
The burden of proof is heavily on you to prove why gravity suddenly doesn't apply.
Exactly. Gravity is the rule.
And this leads to a fascinating, profound critique of major Western philosophies of history within Parwiz's framework. The text directly contrasts the Quranic philosophy of history with thinkers like Karl Marx and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel.
Okay, let's take a slight detour to unpack Marx and Hegel briefly so we understand what Parwiz is arguing against. What was their fundamental view on the flow of history?
Both Marx and Hegel, though they differed in their mechanisms, argued for a concept broadly known as historical necessity or historical determinism.
Okay.
Hegel viewed history as an inevitable march of the world spirit moving through a dialectic, a constant clash of ideas, thesis, and antithesis, inevitably producing a higher synthesis, marching toward an ultimate endpoint of freedom and reason.
And Marx?
Marx took Hegel's dialectic and made it material. He argued that human societies move through strictly inevitable, predetermined stages driven by class conflict over resources.
So stages that just happen no matter what.
Right. In Marx's view, feudalism must mathematically lead to capitalism, and capitalism must inevitably collapse under its own contradictions and lead to socialism and eventually communism.
In both of these views, humans are somewhat helpless passengers. We are just along for the ride on the grand, unstoppable engine of history. We are victims of inevitable stages.
The arc of history bends in a specific direction whether you like it or not.
Right. But the philosophy we are extracting from Al-Furqan today argues something radically different. It perfectly balances human agency with absolute, unyielding law.
Yes. How does it balance them?
Well, you tell me.
The philosophy of the Furqan states that human beings are completely, unconditionally free to choose their system. We have absolute agency in their architectural design phase of our society.
Okay.
We can use our reason to build a hack system, a productive, balanced, equitable one. Or we can allow the vested interest to build a battle system, an extractive, displaced, hoarding one. We are not trapped on a predetermined track.
We make the choice.
Yes. However, and this is the absolute crux of the entire deep dive, once we actively build an extractive system, we cannot change the consequences of that system.
The law of requital takes over, the physics kick in.
Precisely. You have total agency in the input, but you have zero agency over the output. The source material uses a stark, brilliant analogy for this.
The poison analogy.
Yes. Imagine a bottle of lethal poison on a table. If you choose to pick up that bottle and swallow the poison, you have total 100% human agency in the act of swallowing.
Right. No law of physics forced your hand to your mouth.
But once that chemical is in your stomach, your agency ends. You cannot negotiate with the biological outcome.
You cannot sit there and say, well, I know it's poison, but I strongly believe it will act as a vitamin C supplement in my specific body.
The laws of biology don't care about your beliefs. The biology will execute the consequence regardless of your optimism. Similarly, if a society actively chooses an architecture of displacement, if they choose to swallow the poison of Sarmayadari and Malukiyat, they cannot negotiate with the sociological outcome of Tatbeer.
They cannot say, we know wealth inequality destroys societies, but our tech sector is really strong, so we'll be fine.
Exactly. The consequence is locked in.
That brings us to one final critical term from the text that ties this entire theory together into a neat, powerful bow.
The term zelim.
Yes. In verse 37, when referencing the collapsed people of Noah, the text says, وَأَتَدْنَا لِلَوْلِينَ أَدْهَبًا أَلِيمًا. And we prepared for the zalim a painful consequence.
Now, the word zalim is incredibly common, and it is almost universally translated in religious contexts as wrongdoer, sinner, or oppressor. It carries a massive amount of moral, emotional baggage.
But Parwez, staying true to the system's engineering lens, redefines it structurally.
He defines it purely in terms of systemic architecture. A zalim is not just a bad guy in a cartoonish sense. A zalim is the architectural agent of dysfunction.
What does that mean based on the root of the word?
If you look at the Arabic root of the word, it implies displacing something. It means taking a thing, a resource, a right, a truth from its rightful, balanced place in the ecosystem and forcibly putting it where it does not belong.
So a zalim isn't just someone who tells a lie or skips a religious ritual.
No.
A zalim is a CEO who hoards wealth, taking capital out of the circulating productive economy where it belongs, and displacing it into a stagnant offshore account.
Exactly. A zalim is a politician who concentrates political power into the hands of a few cronies, displacing it from the community.
A zalim is a media pundit who displaces reason and nuance with manufactured outrage and dogma.
They are the systemic displacers. They are the individuals actively creating the microfractures in the steel of the bridge.
And therefore, the painful consequence, the Adaban Alima mentioned in the verse, is not a supernatural judgment thrown down from the clouds by an angry, vengeful deity.
It's just the math. It is simply the functional, mathematical output of an architecture built on displacement rather than proper, equitable allocation.
The bridge falls into the river because the steel was displaced from its necessary tension.
Exactly. The society collapses in agony because justice, truth, and resources were violently displaced from the people. The painful consequence is nothing more than the inevitable biological reaction to the poison that the society chose to swallow.
Wow. This has been an incredibly intense, eye-opening intellectual journey today.
It really has been.
We've taken ancient text, stripped away centuries of mythology, superstition, and theological baggage, and revealed history as a brutal but highly legible data set.
And we've learned that the ruins of the past, from the crumbling pillars of Rome to the rusted, hollowed-out factories of the modern Rust Belt, aren't just tourist attractions.
Or backdrops for Instagram selfies.
Right. They are literal, physical warning labels printed by the law of requital. They are the mythal.
And if there is one vital, overarching takeaway from this entire exploration, it is this. Possessing the Furqan, having the intellectual, rational capacity to discriminate between a sustainable hack system and an extractive, batil one, is completely, utterly useless if we allow the vested interest to suppress it.
It is useless if we allow the modern pharaohs, the modern Qurans, and the modern Hamans to convince us that the rust on the bridge is actually making us stronger.
It is useless if we let them convince us that our modern technology, our smartphones, and our AI somehow makes us magically immune to the foundational laws of societal physics.
Right. A smartphone will not save you when the bridge you're standing on collapses.
It won't. So I want to leave you, the listener, with a final, lingering thought to mull over. I want you to apply the Furqan right now.
Look around at the architecture of our own society today.
Yes, look at our incredibly fragile global supply chains. Look at our models of massive wealth distribution, where a handful of people own more than half the planet.
Look at our hyper-polarized political tribalism and the way algorithms dictate and control our information diets to keep us angry and distracted.
If a sociologist from 1,000 years in the future were walking through the physical or even the digital ruins of our era, what microfractures would they say we actively chose to ignore?
What socioeconomic kidney stones were crystallizing right in front of our eyes that we convinced ourselves simply didn't matter?
Just because we thought our advanced technology made us the one glorious exception to the rule. Think about that. Until next time, keep diving deep.